add in all the trains that we
HS2, a train line of the future, promised as the fastest in Europe.
This is going to be faster than Spain, faster than France. It's an extraordinary thing that we're doing.
It was designed to stretch from London to Leeds and Manchester.
We're about to embark on one of the biggest single acts of levelling up of any government in history.
Blimey, it looks like Pompeii.
But after Rishi Sunak cancelled the line to Manchester, the scheme is in tatters.
This is about siphoning billions of pounds of taxpayers' money.
People should be furious. I think this is a kind of chaotic scandal, really.
In the end, it was spiralling costs that sank the scheme.
Every way you look at it, it has failed to deliver anywhere near value for money.
And some claim the failures are more than just bad management.
The playbook was to lie.
Parliament should have been told the truth.
Along the line, people forced to hand over land by HS2 want answers.
All we've done is lost.
We're just the Londoners. Oh, blimey, we're at the bottom of the pile.
We ask, who's responsible?
Can we effectively trust everything that the politicians are saying?
Boris was concerned that if we cancel HS2, it would harm his chances of re-election.
And whether, under the new government, what went wrong could still happen all over again.
The handling of HS2 should be like a morality tale in Whitehall. This was the worst example of utter waste of public money.
Euston, one of London's rail gateways to the north. The billboards promised the arrival of a new high-speed line that would cut the time to Birmingham from an hour and a quarter to just 49 minutes. But behind the fences, there's a different story. This was meant to be the new terminus for HS2. But all major construction work on this 60-acre site has stopped. No one knows if it will start again.
Just has not materialized. So it's a black hole full of money.
It's absolutely going out of order.
That's a policy fail. I mean, it's just not logical.
A failing project, tens of billions of pounds overspent, and piles of rubble in central London. So how did we end up here?
Today saw the launch of Le Supertrain. France's version of the high-speed railway now links Paris to Lyon, and further lines are planned. It's called the TGV.
The inspiration for a British high-speed rail line began in France in the 1980s.
The TGV now holds the world speed record of 237 miles an hour.
I think the genesis of this project was definitely they have them in Europe, in Germany, in France, in Spain. Why can't we have these trains here? We should really be keeping up.
The strain on Britain's ageing rail network was beginning to show.
Many people really felt that we were being left behind, that unless we improved our railways radically, they would stagnate.
Jim Steer was a transport consultant who worked with British Rail. Back then, it was in charge of the railways. He knew there was a worsening problem with capacity.
We've got an antiquated network. We can't add in all the trains that we can see are going to be needed in future. We're going to run out of capacity. By the mid-2020s, their conclusion was the West Coast will be full, and a couple of years later, the East Coast will be full too.
Unless we become more efficient, the railways will die.
Manchester Mayor Andy Burnham grew up near Liverpool in the 1980s.
There was a major problem between the Midlands and the northwest of England. If you compare the transport infrastructure of London and the southeast with the northwest of England, you would be hard pushed to say that this feels like the same country.
But for decades, calls for a new national network went nowhere. But then, In the final months of the last Labour government, a new Transport Secretary decided it was time for change.
Andrew Adonis, who became a Transport Minister in 2008, was the driving force behind the HS2 project. And he was somebody who loved railways.
I've got the tickets.
And he felt that in order to modernise Britain's railway system, HS2 was absolutely essential.
So the question you have to ask is whether you can realistically go through the next 50, 60 years without further investment in connecting our big conurbations.
Jim Steer had been lobbying MPs to develop a new high-speed network.
With Andrew Adonis, he delivered. He set up this company, government-owned company.
The company was called HS2 Limited. It would be entirely funded by the taxpayer. And in less than a year, there was an ambitious plan.
The initial route was based on the idea that it would be a 400-kilometre-an-hour railway, which was unprecedented.
If you go for a new line to add capacity, you make it to contemporary standards.
So this was going to be the fastest, best railway in the world.
The initial plan focused on a line between Euston in London to Birmingham, which became known as Phase 1. Later, plans for a second phase took shape, connecting both Manchester and Leeds.
Her Majesty the Queen has asked me to form a new government, and I have accepted.
With a change of government in 2010, plans for HS2 might have disappeared. A new Transport Secretary, Philip Hammond, was sceptical.
At that time, what was your view on the cost of HS2 and the likely budget?
Well, I think we started at £32 billion.
I do believe if we really are serious about trying to rebalance our economy, make sure we get growth across the country and not just in the southeast, then actually the time for high-speed rail has come, and that's why it has my strong support.
David Cameron, slightly to my surprise, was very clear, we're doing this. And HS2 offered the possibility of changing the economic geography, making Birmingham closer to Euston Station than, say, Croydon would be in travel time. So I became a strong advocate for it.
At the time, Andy Burnham was a Labour MP for a seat in Greater Manchester.
If you bring the cities of Britain closer together from a travel point of view, you absolutely do get levelling up from doing that.
But many of those living along the proposed route of HS2 had a very different view.
It's the wrong priority for the country. It's economically and environmentally disastrous. Yeah.
Do not do this. It's a kind of determined folly.
These are the ones who are going to be paying for it. All of these children are going to be paying for it in years to come.
Joe Rukin lived in Kenilworth in Warwickshire, a town on the path of HS2.
When you look to the original plans, you are seeing the devastation of the countryside and habitats and woodlands and all this thing being absolutely ripped up.
No train, no train, no.
So this is not a question of not in my backyard. This is a question of not anywhere, ever.
When you build a big infrastructure project, you're always going to have individuals who are negatively impacted. It's something you have to deal with in politics. I don't think it was an entirely new phenomenon.
The first big protest that was just about showing him that there is opposition to HS2 because they have simply completely failed to realise how quickly we would get organised.
Some of the strongest early opposition to HS2 centred on one of England's natural beauty spots.
These are the Chiltern Hills in Buckinghamshire, and it's designated an area of outstanding natural beauty. But if you see the big viaduct here behind me, the route for HS2 cuts through here as it goes from Birmingham to London.
Other routes had been considered.
The initial report, commissioned by Andrew Adonis at the beginning of 2009, looked at the different routes.
Some of the possible routes would have passed round the Chilterns near Luton. Others would have still crossed the hills, but on more developed land near the existing M40 motorway. But in the end, a fresh path was chosen, directly through the middle of the Chilterns.
One of the ludicrous aspects of HS2, which I think hamstrung the whole project, was this idea that it should be this gold-plated railway running at 400 kilometres per hour, because it has to be a lot straighter, it can't have big curves, it has to be relatively level. So that having that designed right from the start with a millstone round this project's neck.
The landscape and the desire to avoid large towns also affected the choice of route. But the commitment to make HS2 a super-fast line meant it had to take a straight path, directly through the Chilterns.
There were some very prominent objectors. I think there were cases where the line was actually diverted to avoid particularly difficult situations.
MPs with constituencies along the line lobbied for changes, including tunnels.
If HS2 has to go ahead, in order for any government to hold up its head as far as its green credentials is concerned, this tunnel must go ahead to protect the area of outstanding natural beauty in the Chilterns.
In the end, 11 tunnels were commissioned between London and Birmingham, burying the line for 32 miles of the 140-mile track. But the high-speed route needed more than just tunnels. Phase 1 also includes more than 50 major viaducts.
This is where HS2 leaves London and heads off towards Birmingham. And you can see the challenges of building a high-speed line because it had to be straight. So it had to go across this body of water. All of this engineering to keep it in a straight line.
Here in the Colne Valley, the track crosses over 2 miles of lakes and waterways. It's now the longest railway bridge in the UK.
The pressure came on to start putting cuttings and tunnels and things. And I think we drove much more cost into the project than people perhaps were understanding at the time.
In 2011, HS2 was costed at £32 billion. But after 2 years, including new tunnels and design changes, the budget had jumped to £42 billion. Adding trains, the new grand total was £50 billion, all paid for by the taxpayer. Patrick McLaughlin, who was then the Transport Secretary, said the project was under control.
So here in Manchester, I am proud to support HS2. We will build it carefully and we will build it right, on time and on budget. Thank you very much indeed.
The design changes had already helped to add billions to the budget, but inside the offices of HS2, some were raising new concerns.
I'm Andrew Bruce. I was recruited by High Speed 2 to be their head of planning and performance in their land and property department. My job description was to plan to buy all the land for phase 1.
Before building work could begin, HS2 had to buy thousands of plots of land along the length of the proposed track. Many would be through compulsory purchase.
I was very comfortable with planning and executing large-scale infrastructure projects. Most of my career has been with the Army. I served in Iraq. I was in charge of building all the border forts along the Iraqi border.
But Andrew Bruce says nothing in his career prepared him for what happened next.
In the first week, I was given 2 sets of figures. I was told one set of figures was the figures that we could show the government and we should use in presentations, and it showed that we were on track to be able to purchase the lands within the budget and on time. But I was given a second set of figures that showed something very different. It showed that we had already hugely exceeded the budget with the estimate that we had at the time, and that there was no way we could actually buy the properties.
The official budget for purchasing land for Phase 1 was around £2.8 billion.
I went to one meeting, for example, and I showed the chart with the figures that I'd been given to show that we were already over the 2.8 billion budget. The person running it said, "Andrew, if you say that figure, I'm going to throw this at you," and they had a blackboard eraser. And I said, "But we've gone over it." He then started shouting at me. Being an ex-soldier, you kind of take it. There's an element of humour to it, but there's also an element of, this is not right. You shouldn't be shouted at, you shouldn't be sworn at. You're simply presenting facts.
HS2 says it doesn't recognise these allegations. Doug Thornton was Andrew Bruce's boss and had joined the company shortly before him in 2015.
I'm a chartered surveyor. I was employed by HS2 to purchase all the land, the property required by the project from London to Manchester and Birmingham. I was the new boy, and it became very evident very early that we had a problem. I was seeing some big chunky gaps in the numbers that were being used to take the project forward. Quietly, I'd gone to see Simon Kirby, who was the then chief executive. I said, "Look, I'm kind of concerned as to what I'm seeing here, Simon." I got nothing back. I spoke to board members about it. I spoke to fellow directors.
And what did you get back?
Silence, Stonewall.
We wrote to Simon Kirby. He didn't want to comment. Doug Thornton says things came to a head when he was asked by his boss to prepare property cost estimates for a presentation with some of the company's directors.
She instructed me to prepare a PowerPoint deck using a figure that I knew to be badly incorrect.
Is there a defence for it? Is there a reason that maybe the figures that you were checking weren't sorted out properly?
Not on the basis of the data, no.
She just went ballistic and mad. She was screaming, she was shouting, she was belittling Doug. It was utterly embarrassing to see it. She then started to draw the slides herself, how she'd like to see it.
I think the only reason that she wanted to go with those numbers is that they were convenient and would help the organisation through the review point and onwards to the Act of Parliament. And I simply couldn't do that.
In 2015, HS2 had yet to gain royal assent, the green light from Parliament to authorise the purchase of land.
She wasn't disputing the facts. She wasn't saying they were wrong. What she was saying is, we will not present these figures to the board because the royal assent won't be approved.
I think my chin was on my chest. I just couldn't wait to get out of the room.
Around a week later, Doug Thornton says he raised a complaint with HR about his treatment.
I said, "I want to talk about your grievance process here, because I'm being asked to do something that's badly wrong." The email came back. I think I got sacked within a day.
What does the email say?
"Thanks for your time. Cheerio."
Doug Thornton's former boss says the allegations made by Mr. Thornton and Mr. Bruce are contrary to her recollections of meetings and work during that period, and do not align with any behaviours she recognises from herself or others at HS2 at that time. Doug Thornton was now gone, but a draft of a report he'd commissioned was still in circulation. It said HS2 needed to improve its readiness to buy land and property, and that Andrew Bruce's updated estimate of how much it would cost to buy that land and property should be delivered in a matter of weeks. He says that would have exposed a budget shortfall. His estimate of the costs was now £4.8 billion.
First day that my new director came in, he gave me the instruction to shred every copy. So I was walking around with 10 copies, going around getting another 10 copies, which were just shredded.
Andrew Bruce says he pressed ahead with the update that would expose the budget shortfall.
I prepared a presentation to give to the Department for Transport. I'm sat at my desk and I've got the presentation in front of me. I'm going over it.
From your point of view, this was a meeting that would tell the truth, would say this is how it is.
It would tell the truth, and it would be the starting gun for all other projects to be delivered. And my director, from the side of me, comes and says, "Andrew, can you come with me, please?" And he took me to the opposite side of the building. And he then opened the door, and as I looked in, that there was another lady in there from HR who I recognised. And she's the lady that always appears when somebody gets fired. And there's also security standing outside. And I just realised, oh God, they're not going to allow me to give this. I'm out. I was told I had to leave the building immediately and not to speak to anybody. I was taken out a side door, downstairs, and I was literally just standing out in the streets.
Why do you think you were asked to leave that day and you were fired? Why?
So I think the decision had been made that they weren't going to ask for more money, and this would have exposed them to having to ask that question. I think the decision was made to continue with a lie, that we're on budget, we're on time.
And ignoring data, ignoring facts, what is that, bad management or something worse than that?
If you're deliberately withholding information that you know and presenting figures that you know are incorrect, is fraud. This is British taxpayers' money.
HS2 Limited disputes Andrew Bruce's description of the circumstances of his dismissal and says both he and Doug Thornton had failed their probationary periods. Neither man accepts there were problems with their performance. HS2 also says their allegations are simply untrue. It says there was no order to shred copies of the report. HS2 also says the allegations have been put under intense scrutiny by the National Audit Office, which found nothing untoward. And that the property cost estimate was completely recalculated in 2016, and the NAO found it to be reasonable. Doug Thornton and Andrew Bruce don't accept the conclusions that HS2 draws from the NAO findings. They want further investigation. So, if there was pressure on the budget, what could that mean for landowners in the path of HS2?
Every week, we looked at people who voluntarily were trying to sell their houses through one of the voluntary schemes. So you can imagine your house is right in the middle of the railway, the tracks are coming through it. You try and sell your house, nobody will buy it. But because it's blighted, you can go to the government and say, please buy my house.
The government has an obligation to pay a fair price, as if HS2 had never existed. Andrew Bruce says in his experience, this didn't always happen.
And in almost every circumstance, the person running it would say, and said to me face to face, Andrew, if we start paying people what their properties are valued at, we will run out of our budget very quickly, and it'll be clear there's not enough money and we will not get royal assent.
So just so I'm clear, what you're saying is because the budgets were fudged and the sort of reality was denied, real people were being offered poor deals knowingly by the state because the money wasn't there.
Yes.
That's a scandal, isn't it?
It is a scandal.
HS2 Limited says this is false, and that in all cases it seeks a fair deal for both claimants and the taxpayer, and many safeguards are in place to support this objective. Kevin Bunce, along with his brother Pete, runs a farm in the Chilterns. It lies directly in the path of HS2. They own 100 acres of farmland. HS2 is taking nearly 20 of them. They believe their compensation from HS2 is inadequate.
We've lost 20 acres over there out of a 35-acre field. We've had a little bit of compensation for loss of crops on that land.
Is that enough to cover what you were making from grain?
No near enough. It's affected our income no end because we've lost all this land, so we haven't been able to grow as much corn. It's just affected our business big time.
HS2's building work has effectively cut the Bunces' land in two, making it hard for them to run the farm.
Are there bits of your land you can't get to, or if you're just doing your job, how's it affected you?
We have to stop at the gate, phone a number and get escorted across.
Does that delay you?
It can do. You can sit there half hour, three-quarters an hour.
And that's just to grow across what used to be your land?
Well, yeah.
You feel you've been treated badly?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, we're just one of many who in the same boat.
Kevin's brother Pete says their business is struggling.
What impact has it had on the business? How would you describe it?
Well, a disaster. We haven't been treated fair.
What's it sort of done to your family and your life?
I don't think they consider the impact on people's health or mental health, what all this stress has done to people.
It's partly destroyed us. All we've done is lost. And HS2, to my mind, are on the take. All the time they're on the take. They don't want to give you anything.
HS2 says it will continue to work with the Bunce family to resolve their compensation and access issues.
Later today, the first phase of the HS2 rail line between London and the Midlands is expected to receive the official go-ahead in the House of Commons.
More than a year after Andrew Bruce and Doug Thornton uncovered what they believed were massive budget shortfalls, Phase 1 of the project, the line to Birmingham, was poised to receive approval in Parliament to finally tender contracts for major construction work. It was a big moment.
Secretary Chris Grayling.
Today, Mr. Speaker, marks a major milestone in the government's plans to deliver High Speed 2. High Speed 2 will deliver economic growth across the United Kingdom. It will provide faster journeys and better connections between cities across the UK. And I commend this statement to the House.
Despite this being a multi-billion-pound national infrastructure project paid for by all of us, there were other issues on MPs' minds.
So one of the contexts to HS2 going through Parliament was, of course, that all the discussion was, at the time, about Brexit.
Philip Hammond was now Chancellor, working under the new Prime Minister, Theresa May.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, but HS2 was not the main issue of the moment. The government was teetering on the brink, trying to deal with the daily, hourly pressures of the Brexit negotiation, and long-term projects were perhaps not seen as quite as immediately urgent.
By 2017, the official budget for HS2 had only risen once in 4 years, from £50 billion to £55.7 billion. This rise was only to take account of inflation.
Before Royal Assent, the figures were incorrect. Budget should have been updated, programmes should have been updated. Parliament would have had the opportunity to take a decision on HS2, based on truthful numbers and truthful programme. I believe Parliament was misled.
And it's not just the land and property budget some were calling into question. An internal government document produced just before Royal Assent suggested the overall budget was also not realistic. It said the project was highly likely to go over by up to 60%, to more than £80 billion.
If a figure that was known to be higher than 55.7 wasn't put before Parliament, so therefore they weren't allowed to vote on the real figures, and Parliament was misled, how serious would that be?
Parliament won't have been misled. It would be absurd to suggest that every piece of modelling that's done in the Treasury has to be presented to decision makers in Parliament or indeed ministers. You can't work that way. It's a unique project. It's a piece of engineering that's got all sorts of risk, massive amounts of contingency within it. Any price quoted, even now, is just an estimate.
A year and a half after royal assent, the Department for Transport's most senior civil servant was still quoting the government's position that the budget remained £55.7 billion.
Overall, we are very clear that we are determined that HS2 Limited will bring this project in within the overall funding envelope of £55.7 billion.
Where's the sanction if they do go over?
But that's not
It's not an option.
It's
I
not
need
an
to take
option.
clearly, yes.
It's not an option we are prepared to contemplate.
I chaired the House of Commons Public Accounts Committee for 9 years. I remember that hearing very vividly because what we then learned later was that the confidence that this would land at the 55 billion figure was very misplaced, and yet the department and HS2 was sticking to this figure.
This idea that people inside HS2 were aware that the budgets just weren't real and they were in denial when people raised the issue. Was that something that you had heard, something that you were familiar with?
Well, certainly, I mean, it's a familiar song, I'm afraid. What happens is we hide behind a number, and that number stays until some pressure pushes out the real situation.
Is the current model one that you can cook the books and you can get away with it?
Well, I think it's a dance that gets played. It's this sort of shadow boxing that goes on between the taxpayer, Parliament and government. And people who, paying their taxes, they should expect, quite rightly, that every tax pound that they give the government should equally be spent carefully and that they should know how it's being spent and what the problems are. But I think in the heart of government, we need to see that transparency about spending so that there are fewer surprises.
Dame Bernadette Kelly says when she appeared before the committee, her comments were accurate. With parliamentary approval in the bag, HS2 Limited could finally start the groundwork ahead of construction. But the arrival of a new chairman meant it was time to face financial reality.
Well, I'm Alan Cook, and I was previously chairman of HS2 from 2018 to 2021. It was probably the pinnacle of my career. That's really how I looked at it. This is a fantastic opportunity. I saw the economic benefit that we were going to get from places like the West Midlands, places like Manchester, places like Liverpool, and the North East and Scotland.
When you joined, what was the budget?
55.7 billion.
And when had that been set, and did it seem realistic to you?
2015, and no, it didn't. Chris Grayling, the Secretary of State, he said to me, look, this programme is 55.7 billion. If it's anything more than that, forget it. We need to find a way for doing it within this envelope. And so I said, I'm going to carry out and do a stock take. It actually brought it up to round about 80 billion at that particular point in time.
Exactly as predicted by that internal government report back in 2017, the expected cost was now up to almost £80 billion. A figure nearly 2.5 times as much as the original budget in 2011.
What it means to our viewers is the day before you came in and for the previous 3 or 4 years, ministers and others were saying a budget which they knew was probably wrong, but they were saying it, and the rest of us, we just had to believe that was true, but they will have known it to be untrue. Is that right?
I think that generally that in the context that would have been right. But they were parroting the 55.7 because that was the figure that had been approved.
But inside HS2 Limited, many of the senior executives who'd seen the project approved on a budget of £55.7 billion had already gone. Those who left HS2 within a year of royal assent included the chief executive and 10 other members of the senior management team.
Now, there is an argument for having different people running different stages of a project, but in terms of continuity, in terms of watching money, it's easy to say, well, the last lot just didn't get the maths right. Now we've uncovered the true reality. It's an easy way of breaking that line of accountability.
With many of the former top team gone, it was up to new chairman Alan Cook to break the news that the budget of £55.7 billion was hopelessly out of date. In April 2019, he held a meeting with the Department for Transport.
Tell us about it. Who's there?
Michael Bradley, CFO, myself, the Secretary of State, Chris Grayling, at that particular point in time, and Nusrat Ghani.
Nusrat Ghani was a junior transport minister.
This is a big moment then. This is a lot of people gathered. And what are you telling them about the budget?
The budget of 55.7 was not achievable under the current scope.
It was a dramatic moment. Although he hadn't yet published his near £80 billion figure, a chairman of HS2 was admitting they could no longer stick to the official budget. But just 3 months later, a statement to Parliament made by Nusrat Ghani took Alan Cook by surprise.
There is just one budget, there is one timetable, and HS2 will continue on track. And I was asked by the member for South Northamptonshire if I could confirm at the dispatch box what the budget was and what the timetable is, and I can confidently stand here today and say the budget is 55.7 billion and the timetable is 2026 and 2033.
Yep. Why would she say that 55.7 is still the budget? She knows it's not true.
Well, because 55.7 was the budget, and that was the figure that was approved through royal assent.
In April 2019, you met Nus Ghani and you told her the budget of 55.7 is no longer a legitimate thing to carry around. In July, Nus Ghani stands up and says what she says. What do you think about that?
I think that she'd obviously either A, forgotten about the meeting that took place, or B, was actually still not recognising that the programme could not be completed in that particular time frame at that particular cost.
There is a C in that she's not telling the full story.
There is a C that she is particularly, if we want to be particular about this, being conservative with the truth.
And what do you think?
I think that she was probably being conservative with the truth.
We wrote to Nusrat Ghani. She didn't respond.
I was frustrated because we were dealing with a political situation that I and the team had absolutely no control over.
What should our viewers make of it?
Can we effectively trust everything that the politicians are saying? What we're finding now is that actually we can't trust them.
My job is to serve you, the people.
Soon after Boris Johnson became Prime Minister, Cook's warnings about cost increases were made public. And now, in the heart of government, was a man determined the project should be brought under control.
I'm Andrew Gilligan. I was for 25 years a journalist. I'd worked with Boris at City Hall, helping to deliver the bike lanes on the embankment and other places. He appointed me as transport advisor when he became Prime Minister.
When you heard of HS2, when you first heard of it, what was your reaction?
I was convinced that high-speed rail was wrong for England because unlike Spain or France or Germany, all the main cities of England are within 200 miles of all the others. The only exception to that, Newcastle. And at distances of less than 200 miles, high-speed rail just doesn't make sense. The time you save simply isn't worth the enormous extra expense of building it.
And what was Mr. Johnson's attitude to HS2?
Well, I was fairly sure that he was a supporter of HS2. He quite liked big, stupid projects. Obviously, this was big and stupid to an extraordinary degree, but he'd obviously done lots of stupid things before, like the cable car.
Just this way, Boris. Cabin crew doors to manual. Cabin crew Dawson manual and cross-check.
They clearly were stupid under any definition of the word, but actually far cheaper than HS2. That's the difference. HS2 is extremely stupid, but also extremely expensive.
Later that year, Johnson's successful re-election campaign meant HS2 now provided a unique political opportunity. Eddie Lister was the Downing Street Chief of Staff.
In 2019, the party is deeply divided over Brexit. There are a lot of MPs who are very passionate one way or the other. So Boris, he made the decision to prioritise levelling up.
Then we must fight now for those who feel left behind. We need now to level up. We want to unite and level up. Unite and level up. To unite and level up across the whole United Kingdom and unleash the potential of all our people.
So he'd scored a huge victory on the basis of an awful lot of people who'd never voted Tory before in the North. And again, he was concerned that if we cancelled HS2, it would harm his chances of re-election. But at the same time, he recognised what a shower HS2 Limited was. I mean, I was at all the meetings. I'm there and I'm making notes. And so the PM said, it fills me with rage to see how much money is being spent on this thing and how badly it's being spent. But there is no other project we can deliver on this scale in the next 5 years, and we'll pay a big political price for scrubbing it. So he'd just been elected on a manifesto to level up the country, right? And one of the arguments that HS2 lobby successfully put was that scrapping it didn't look like levelling up.
Andrew Gilligan was convinced that backing HS2 for political reasons was a mistake. His influence with the Prime Minister was bad news for HS2's chairman, Alan Cook.
Andrew Gilligan was just completely, totally against HS2. A white elephant, a complete nonsense, better use of our money, why can't we just use it on other things? Andrew Gilligan was a bully. He was a very intelligent bully, but he was a bully.
I didn't rant and rave, I didn't shout, I was just kind of robust. I was completely clear that the cost would be far higher than even the slightly uplifted cost announced by Alan Cook in his stock take. The PM's view was that these people needed a kick up the bum, and they got it.
The spiralling costs of HS2 meant pressing ahead could leave the government open to criticism.
It just seemed to be a drip, drip, drip of cost increases that kept on coming through. And of course, the voices of concern grew louder and louder.
Before a final decision was made on whether the main stage of construction on Phase 1 should go ahead, Boris Johnson ordered a review.
Good evening. The future of the HS2 rail line has been thrown into doubt after the government announced an independent review into the project.
Just because you spent a lot of money on something should not mean that you just carry on ploughing more and more money into it.
The Oakervee report was really pretty much the last chance of cutting the whole scheme. But Boris somewhat weighted the likely findings in favour of HS2 by appointing Doug Oakervee as former chairman of HS2 Limited to run the report.
I pointed out to Boris that Doug was also a former chair of HS2 and might have a certain measure of bias in these things.
So Boris had forgotten that?
He claimed to have forgotten that, yeah. So, and in
what did you think about a former chairman?
Look, in retrospect, I thought it was ridiculous.
But Andrew Gilligan had a plan. He made sure the deputy chair of the committee would be a different voice to Oakervee.
Sir, thank you for joining us.
Labour peer Tony Barclay had been a long-time critic of HS2's rising costs.
Take one.
I got a phone call from Andrew Gilligan saying we're having this inquiry into HS2. Would you like to go on it? I felt uncomfortable from the very start, and I could see that it was being run by Department of Transport officials. Nothing independent about it at all. The real problem for me was that I could not get into the costs.
Why?
Because they're all confidential. So I decided that I had to resign from it. And I said, there's something funny going on here, you know.
Okavi's report had some criticisms of HS2's management, but said, on balance, it should go ahead. But opponents of HS2 were still calling for the scheme to be killed off for good.
What do we want to stop HS2? When do we want it? Now!
What HS2 is building a fast train for fat cats.
My criticism of HS2 is that the costs are out of control.
With Boris Johnson now due to give his own verdict, the future of HS2 seemed to hang in the balance.
There was intense activity. There was people lobbying the Prime Minister. I was worried that at the end of the day that the Prime Minister was going to stand up in Parliament and say that he was going to cancel the programme.
Guess who I'm about to meet?
Hi, how are you doing?
How are you? Nice
to see you.
Which seat do you prefer?
This one here. No, this one, I'll go here. Which one do you prefer?
I don't mind. Which one do you prefer?
There's a really significant moment when Boris Johnson is interviewed by a schoolboy about HS2, and the boy asks, well, you know, is there a problem here?
The whole way it was managed was hopeless. So we're in a hole, we're in a mess.
Oh, no.
But we've got to get out of it.
Well, I'm sure with you as Prime Minister, I'm sure you'll get out of the deep hole. Is it a deep hole or is it a small one?
In a hole the size of HS2, the only thing to do is keep digging.
In a hole as deep as HS2, you've just got to keep digging. My head went into my hands.
He basically dropped a strong hint that he was going to carry on with HS2.
What he's saying is, we've got this bloody big hole, and actually, we've got to keep digging. Mr. Johnson, I absolutely agree on that.
By this stage, one independent assessment put the likely cost of HS2 at £108 billion. But in the end, this wasn't enough to stop Boris Johnson officially announcing the go-ahead for major construction on Phase 1.
The Prime Minister had just won a massive landslide. He was the Sun King. He was the Prime Minister. He was the elected person. You know, we had to do what he wanted.
So today, Mr. Speaker, the Cabinet has given high-speed rail the green signal. We are going to get this done. This is going to be the fastest high-speed rail link in Europe. I mean, faster than Spain, faster than France. It's an extraordinary thing that we're doing. Blimey, it looks like Pompeii. Fantastic.
We wrote to Boris Johnson, he didn't respond. With construction on Phase 1 guaranteed, it was soon time to start buying land for Phase 2, part of the track north of Birmingham. Joy Fielding owns a farm on the path of HS2 near Lichfield in Staffordshire. At the time of Johnson's TV bombshell, HS2 had plans to compulsory purchase around 65 acres of her land, about a third of her farm.
This idea that if you're in a big hole, you've got to keep digging. What do you think about that?
Well, if you're in a big hole, maybe you ought to get out of it.
In the end, 15 acres were taken through compulsory purchase. But like many others, Joy Fielding has yet to receive the full balance of money she's owed.
We're talking a year and a half ago now, and we're still only sitting on 90%.
What were they like to deal with, though, when you're negotiating things like that? What are they like to deal with?
Some who we've had dealings with for years have tried as much as they can, but the stuff that comes from on high is just awful, really.
What do you think how do they see you, do you think?
Oh, blimey, we're at the bottom of the pile. Goodness me, we're right at the bottom. We're just the Londoners. We are absolutely not important in any way.
HS2 says it stands ready to work with Joy Fielding to complete her claim.
The facts have changed, and the right thing to do when the facts change
is to have the courage to change direction. And so, I am ending this long-running saga. I am cancelling the rest of the HS2 project.
The Leeds leg of HS2 had already been cancelled. Rishi Sunak's announcement meant the only remaining section of HS2 to be built is the line running between Birmingham and London.
I felt furious about both the decision and the way he did it. We wrote to him in advance saying, look, you're in our city, find time to discuss this with us. But we just got absolutely the shutters pulled down on us. What was lost was a coherent plan for connecting the north of England with the rest of the country.
And it wasn't only phase 2 of HS2 Rishi Sunak had in his sights.
The management of HS2 will no longer be responsible for the Euston site. There must be some accountability for the mistakes made, for the mismanagement of this project.
The original plan was for HS2 to go via a tunnel from Old Oak Common in West London to the centre at Euston. The tunnel hasn't been officially cancelled, but without any decision on how to fund it, main construction can't begin.
A decision not to build from Old Oak Common to Euston would be fatal to the project.
One of the real conundrums of this is if you have to get out to Old Oak Common to take a high-speed line train, it will add half an hour to your journey, which is precisely the time savings that HS2 was supposed to be making.
£1.5 billion has already been spent on land and preparatory work in Euston, all for a station that may now never connect with the rest of the line.
This is Drummond Street in Euston. It's a vibrant old neighbourhood right in the centre of London. But it's been changed forever by HS2 because work on the new station has cut Drummond Street in half.
For years, the works have made life challenging for local businesses.
It was really hard. When the work started, it all became very confused. Sometimes they'd shut the road off there, sometimes they shut it off there. We wouldn't really know. Are the customers going to stop coming?
What's the worst case scenario for you?
The worst case scenario, I guess, would be that nothing would happen and we would have all the pain of development and not knowing where we're going with this.
So you'd live with this forever?
We live with a building site down the road, yeah.
But it's not just Euston left in limbo. The last government already spent £592 million on land for phase 2. Although the northern leg has now officially been cancelled, landowners still have no idea if their land will ever be returned.
What's the chance of getting the land back? Is that your ideal scenario, that you just get your land back?
Well, you've got to find the money, of course, to buy it back, because if you've already paid tax on it, you haven't got the money to buy it back, have you?
So even if you just get your land back, you will lose money in that process?
Well, oh yes, of course, massively.
Are you angry about that?
Well, yes, we are angry.
But many landowners might have to wait far longer for answers. Andy Burnham and the Mayor of the West Midlands have just backed a plan led by a private sector consortium to use land originally intended for the cancelled phase of HS2 to create a new rail project.
It's not going back to HS2. We accept that that argument has gone, but it is about an alternative to it, lower cost probably.
There's not much money knocking about, is there, in the new government? And when you sit down with the Prime Minister and say, this is what we need, it's not HS2, but it's a bit like it, do you think he will give you his backing?
I think it's about looking at the evidence, isn't it? And the evidence is clear. It's even accepted by the Department for Transport. The West Coast Main Line will be full by the mid-2030s.
As things stand, new HS2 trains would run on the old West Coast Main Line once they travel north of Birmingham. But because these new trains may have fewer seats than existing services, capacity may actually get worse.
So if the plan is that we are going to have worse intercity rail travel by the middle of this century, that is fundamentally unacceptable to people here.
As late as last year, Keir Starmer called on the previous government to get on with building HS2 in its entirety. Before the election, he changed his position.
Look, I don't think it's possible to do HS2. I think the government's blown the budget. The contracts are going to be cancelled. It does not mean that we won't have a plan for transport in the North West.
Now in power, Labour has yet to say what that plan is. Transport Secretary Louise Haigh says the costs of HS2 spiralled out of control under previous Conservative governments, and that the serious financial challenges we have inherited on this project have become apparent, and it's dire. She also says in the coming weeks she will set out next steps to ensure lessons are learnt and the mistakes of HS2 are never repeated again.
I think a public inquiry is due on this project. This is about you know what we expect government in this country to do with our taxpayers' funds. We haven't got money for hospitals, we haven't got money for schools, but yet there's tens of millions of pounds flowing out the door at HS2. Why are we still continuing to spend that cash when we know that the means by which it's been obtained is questionable?
Since Phase 2 was cancelled, HS2 has dropped out of the headlines. But this is a section between London and Birmingham, and you can see it's still very much alive.
It could be 9 years before passengers can use HS2, the last official cost up to £54 billion. But one independent assessment says the real figure will be far higher, almost £88 billion. It means the cost of the single remaining leg could end up being more than double the original budget for the entire line.
The handling of HS2 should be like a morality tale in Whitehall. This is how not to do it. This was the worst example of utter waste of public money.
Not completing HS2 has been, I think, a disaster. I think we have completely underestimated what this programme could do, not only for me and for my kids, but for my grandsons and for their generation.
Over the coming years, the government says it has big plans for British infrastructure, from new nuclear power stations to a vast network of wind farms. But if lessons aren't learnt about how billions were blown on HS2, there's a risk with the next national mega project, the same thing could happen all over again.